I spent almost 20 years turning my husband into an American logistics icon. Then, at our corporate gala, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and flashing cameras, his mistress slid a $50 million divorce settlement across the table. She smiled like it was charity. The entire room waited for me to shatter. Instead, the ballroom doors swung open. My daughter walked in, looked at the check, and said the words that would freeze the room. "Mom, take it. I am Bianca Hathaway. At 44 years of age, I know exactly what it takes to build an empire. And more importantly, I know the exact weight of the silence required to sustain one. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. The grand ballroom of the hotel was suffocating under the weight of crystal chandeliers and the heavy scent of imported orchids. We were here to commemorate the 15-year anniversary of Stonegate Corridor Systems going public. It was the logistics conglomerate run by my husband, Everett Sloan. To the outside world, Everett was the self-made titan of American supply chains. To me, he was the man I had constructed from the ground up. When I met him, Everett owned a struggling regional fleet of trucks. I was the daughter of a Midwestern family that owned one of the largest intermodal freight networks in the country. I did not just give him my inheritance. I gave him the lifeblood of his current success. I handed him my family's network of partners. I drafted the operational compliance frameworks that allowed him to scale. I brokered the quiet financial relationships that kept him afloat when the banks wanted to swallow him whole. I was the architect, and he was the face. For almost 2 decades, I played my part perfectly. I stepped into the ballroom tonight expecting nothing more than another forced evening. Our marriage had been rotting from the inside for years, hollowed out by his ego and my exhaustion. I wore a heavy sapphire gown, draped myself in the requisite diamonds, and prepared to smile for the cameras. But the moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere felt distinctly wrong. The air was entirely too still. I noticed the investors first. The men from the private equity firms were not mingling. They were clustered near the open bar, their eyes tracking me with a strange, clinical anticipation. Then I saw the internal media team. Their cameras were not aimed at the stage or the towering ice sculptures. They were subtly angled toward my table. Even the Sloan family, Everett's mother, his brother, his sycophantic cousins were seated together, radiating a nervous, predatory energy. It felt less like a corporate gala and more like an execution where the tickets had been sold well in advance. They were waiting for a show. Suddenly, the gentle hum of the string quartet died out. The music stopped so abruptly that the ensuing silence rang in my ears. Everett stood at the center table and tapped his crystal champagne flute. The sharp clinking sound demanded the room's absolute attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Everett began, his voice booming through the hidden microphones. He wore a bespoke tuxedo, looking every inch the king I had bought and paid for. "Tonight, we celebrate 15 years of Stonegate. We celebrate growth, resilience, and the future. But to step into the future, one must be honest about the past." He paused. The room held its breath. I kept my posture perfectly straight, though a cold dread began to pool in my stomach. "For many years, I have poured my soul into this company while returning to a home that was profoundly empty," Everett said, his tone dripping with practiced sorrow. "I have lived in a cold marriage, but true success is impossible without true partnership. Recently, I found someone who understands the vision of Stonegate, someone who has finally given me the understanding and warmth I have been starving for." He extended his hand toward the shadows just off the main floor. Out stepped Celeste Rowan. Celeste was the brand director for Stonegate. She was wearing a perfectly tailored, minimalist white dress. It was a calculated choice. The dress screamed of fresh starts and modern elegance, a stark contrast to my heavy, traditional sapphires. She did not look down. She did not blush. She did not play the role of the shameful other woman. Instead, she glided across the floor with the serene confidence of a queen arriving to claim her throne. She was entirely ruthless in her gentleness. Celeste walked straight to my seat. She held a thick manila folder in her hands. The room was so quiet, I could hear the rustle of the heavy paper. She stopped right in front of me. smiling a smile that looked exactly like charity. "Bianca," Celeste said, her voice like velvet, amplified just enough for the surrounding tables to hear every syllable. "You should leave with your dignity intact. Everett has been incredibly generous. We both want you to be comfortable." She placed the folder on the table and slid it precisely to the edge of my dinner plate. It was a drafted divorce settlement. "If you sign tonight," Celeste continued, her eyes locking onto mine with an icy calm, "Everett is prepared to offer you $50 million. You will also receive the penthouse in Boston and a comprehensive lump sum for your immediate transition. It is a very graceful exit. You should take it." She was managing me. The brand director was managing the founder's wife in front of 500 people. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of the ambush, the Sloan family moved in to play their rehearsed parts. Everett's mother leaned forward from the adjacent table, her face pinched with a bitter satisfaction she had hidden for 20 years. "Be reasonable, Bianca," his mother said loudly. "You are simply no longer suited for the future of Stonegate. Everett needs a modern partner, not an anchor from the past." Her voice acted as a signal. Everett's brother-in-law, a man whose gambling debts I had personally paid off 3 years ago, snorted into his drink. "$50 million is a hell of a windfall," he sneered, making sure the investors nearby could hear his mockery. "Especially for someone who only knows how to throw dinner parties and wear heavy gems. I would sign it before he wakes up and realizes what a bad deal he's making." I looked at Everett. He was standing there, watching me be verbally dismantled by the people I had enriched. He did not look guilty. He looked victorious. "Listen to them, Bianca," Everett said, his voice dropping the theatrical sorrow and turning as hard as flint. "If you do not sign those papers tonight, before this gala ends, I promise you my legal team will unleash a war that will take years. We will freeze every shared asset. We will drag your name through every financial publication in this country. It will be a destructive, miserable fight, and I swear to God, you will walk away with much, much less." My hands rested on my lap. The sheer public violence of the moment threatened to crush the breath right out of my lungs. They had planned this down to the minute. The cameras were waiting for me to cry. Celeste was waiting for me to scream. Everett was waiting for me to break. They had priced me at $50 million and expected me to run away in shame. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I prepared to stand up. I prepared to tell Everett exactly what he could do with his $50 million and his brand director. But just as my lips parted to speak, a heavy thud echoed from the back of the room. The massive oak doors of the ballroom burst open. The sudden noise whipped every head around. The security guards stationed by the entrance stepped back, confused and hesitant. Walking through the doors, pulling a battered leather carry-on suitcase, was my daughter. Greer Hathaway had just landed on a red-eye flight from New York. She was still wearing her dark wool trench coat, her hair slightly messy from the turbulent flight. She did not stop at the reception desk. She did not look at the ice sculptures. She ignored the sea of gaping faces, the flashing cameras, and the bewildered murmurs of the elite crowd. She marched straight down the center aisle, the wheels of her suitcase clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. She walked right past her father without so much as a glance. She walked right past Celeste, treating the woman in the minimalist white dress like a ghost. Greer stopped at my side. She looked down at the table. She looked at the heavy manila folder. She read the bold print on the divorce petition. Then, she looked at the cashier's check neatly clipped to the front page. $50 million. She let go of her suitcase. It hit the floor with a final, heavy sound. Greer turned her gaze to me. Her eyes were absolutely clear, devoid of panic, devoid of sorrow. They were terrifyingly sharp. She leaned down, tapped her finger aggressively against the check, and spoke the only words that mattered. "Mom, take it." A collective exhale washed over the grand ballroom. It was a sickening sound, a wave of palpable relief rippling through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. In their eyes, my daughter had just delivered the final, fatal blow to my dignity. The crowd assumed Greer was siding with her father. They believed she had flown across the country simply to talk her hysterical mother off the ledge, to convince me to surrender quietly so the party could resume. I watched Everett's posture relax. The tight defensive set of his shoulders dropped. A smug, paternal smile touched his lips as he looked at Greer. He actually thought she was his ally. He thought his money and his power had bought her loyalty, just as he believed it had bought him this room. But Greer did not look at Everett the way a daughter looks at a father. Her eyes were completely devoid of familial warmth. She looked at him the way a senior creditor looks at a defaulting debtor. She reached across the white linen tablecloth. Her manicured fingers bypassed the divorce petition entirely and picked up the cashier's check. She held the thick slip of paper up to the light of the chandeliers, her face an unreadable mask. She flipped it over. She examined the watermarks, the signature line, the date. Then, she dropped it back onto the plate. It landed with a soft, dismissive slap. "A post-dated check is not money," Greer said. Her voice was not a shout, but it possessed a sharp, cutting resonance that carried effortlessly over the silent tables. "It is a piece of paper carrying a promise from a man who has just publicly demonstrated he does not keep them. I only believe in wire transfers." The silence that followed was entirely different from the one before. This was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a vacuum, of all the air being violently sucked out of the room. Celeste moved first. She stepped slightly in front of Everett, her white dress catching the spotlight. She attempted a patronizing, pitying smile, clearly trying to maintain her newly claimed territory. "Greer, darling," Celeste purred, her tone dripping with fake maternal concern. "You are emotional from your flight. We understand that, but you are behaving in a manner that is incredibly rude and, quite frankly, terribly greedy. Your father is offering your mother a fortune out of the goodness of his heart. There is no need for this kind of hostility." Greer turned her head slowly. She did not raise her chin or puff out her chest. She simply looked at Celeste, as if examining a rather uninteresting insect that had crawled onto the bargaining table. "I am not your darling," Greer replied, her voice dropping an octave, settling into a cold courtroom cadence. "I am a corporate restructuring attorney. And if Stonegate is as financially robust as Everett has been boasting to this room for the last hour, then $50 million in liquid cash on a Friday night should be absolute pocket change. Unless, of course, the great logistics king has a liquidity crisis he is hiding from his investors." A sharp intake of breath echoed from the private equity tables to my left. Greer knew exactly what she was doing. She was not attacking his morality. She was attacking his solvency. Everett's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. The smugness vanished, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated panic of a man whose bluff had just been called in front of his financial backers. "Do not play games with me in front of my guests, Greer," Everett hissed, stepping around Celeste to close the distance. He pointed a rigid finger at the divorce papers. "The deal is on the table tonight. She signs the petition right now, and the check clears on Monday morning. That is how adults conduct business." "No," Greer countered instantly, blocking his path without taking a single physical step forward. Her presence alone was a barricade. That is how desperate men conduct theater. Basic contract law dictates that an agreement is only binding when the obligation of consideration is fulfilled. If you do not transfer the funds tonight, this entire spectacle is nothing but a paper play manufactured for the morning press. You want the signature? You pay for it. Now." The whispers erupted. They started at the edges of the ballroom and swept inward like a sudden tide. I could hear the distinct, clipped tones of Wall Street analysts and venture capitalists murmuring to each other. The mood had violently shifted. 10 minutes ago, they were quietly mocking the discarded wife. Now they were staring at Everett, their eyes narrowed, calculating, wondering why the chief executive officer of a massive public company was sweating over a standard settlement payout. They realized my daughter had not come here to cry or plead. She had come to cut off every escape route. I sat perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did not fully comprehend the architecture of the trap Greer was building. For months, I had been drowning in the humiliation of my failing marriage, blinded by grief and betrayal. But looking up at my daughter, I saw a terrifying, beautiful certainty in her eyes. It was a ruthless clarity I used to possess before I let Everett Sloane hollow me out. I did not need to know the entire plan. I only needed to know she had one. I leaned back in my chair and decided to play this hand to the absolute bloody end. "She is right, Everett," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. I did not look at Celeste. I kept my eyes locked on the man I had built. "You want to buy me out of my own life? Show me you actually have the capital." Everett was cornered. He was trapped between his towering ego and the watchful, predatory eyes of his shareholders. He could not refuse without looking insolvent. He could not back down without looking weak. He was a man who lived and died by his public image, and Greer had just put his reputation on the line. With a trembling hand, Everett reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his phone. He did not break eye contact with Greer as he dialed. "Get me Owen," Everett barked into the receiver, demanding his chief financial officer. He waited 2 agonizing seconds. "Owen, I need a wire transfer initiated immediately. $50 million. Yes, right now. I do not care what hoops you have to jump through with the private banking tier. Force it through." He lowered the phone slightly, his eyes blazing with hatred. "Where is the money going?" Greer calmly unzipped the small side pocket of her leather suitcase. She withdrew a single sheet of heavy bond paper and slid it across the table. "Routing and account numbers are there," Greer said. "It is a blind trust account under my mother's name, fortified by 3 layers of fiduciary protection. Tell Owen to use the federal wire system. I want the confirmation code before anyone picks up a pen." Everett snatched the paper. He read the numbers into his phone, his voice tight with suppressed rage. The room waited in absolute electrified silence. We stood there for 7 excruciating minutes. The only sound was the clinking of ice melting in unattended cocktail glasses. Then, my phone vibrated in my evening clutch. I opened it. The screen illuminated my face in the dim ballroom light. It was an automated notification from my private wealth manager. The deposit had cleared. The funds were locked. I looked up. Everett shoved the manila folder toward me. "Sign it," he demanded, his breathing shallow. "You got your money. Now give me my freedom." I picked up the heavy gold pen lying next to the plate. I did not hesitate. I did not let a single tear fall. I signed my name with sharp, aggressive strokes on every tabbed page. I pushed the folder back across the table. Celeste smiled. It was a radiant, victorious smile. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought she had just successfully purchased a kingdom. Everett let out a long, ragged breath, looking around the room as if expecting applause for surviving the ordeal. He believed he had just bought his freedom. He believed he had excised me from his empire forever. Greer stepped closer to my chair. She leaned down, her dark coat brushing against my bare shoulder. She kept her eyes fixed on Everett and Celeste, but her mouth hovered just inches from my ear. "Let them smile," Greer whispered, her voice so low only I could hear the icy certainty in her words. "They just paid for the strike that will destroy them." The heavy leather door of the town car closed, shutting out the flashing lights of the hotel and the staring eyes of the valet line. The engine hummed, a low and steady vibration that finally allowed the adrenaline to bleed out of my system. We glided into the Boston night. I stared at the street lamps blurring past the tinted windows, letting the silence of the vehicle wash over me. Greer sat next to me. She did not lean back. She did not take a moment to breathe. Instead, she unlatched her battered leather suitcase right there in the back seat. It was not packed with clothes or travel amenities. It was packed with dense legal binders. "You have been busy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have been digging," Greer replied, pulling a thick black binder onto her lap. "For 8 months." She opened the cover and handed me a stack of title deeds. I recognized the heavy, watermarked paper immediately. It was the master file for the Hathaway Corridor Trust. "They think you are just a wife they can pay off," Greer said, turning on the small reading light above her head. "Everett thinks he built an empire, but look at the concrete he built it on." I stared at the documents. They were the property records for 6 strategic transit hubs: Charlotte, Columbus, Memphis, Savannah, Tulsa, Reno. These were the beating heart of Stonegate Corridor systems. Everett loved to stand in front of shareholders, financial press, and industry peers to boast about our permanent control over these vital arteries of American logistics. But that control was an absolute illusion. Stonegate did not own those properties. My family trust owned them. I owned them. Decades ago, when Everett was desperate for capital to expand a failing regional fleet, I gave him the ultimate competitive advantage. I leased these 6 massive facilities to Stonegate for a fraction of their market value. It was a silent family discount meant to keep his balance sheet exceptionally clean so he could secure better loan terms from aggressive commercial banks. I even paid for the structural maintenance, the commercial insurance, and the municipal operating permits out of my own pocket. I never publicly demanded reimbursement. I just wanted my husband to succeed. "Turn to page 40, Greer instructed, pointing a manicured finger at the binder. I flipped the heavy pages. It was a forensic audit of the maintenance escrow accounts required by the master lease agreements. "Over the past 3 years," Greer explained, her voice entirely clinical and devoid of emotion, "Stonegate has systematically failed to fund the physical upkeep of the properties. They stopped making the required monthly deposits into the structural maintenance fund. But that is not the worst part. Look at the vendor disbursement logs." I scanned the ledgers. Millions of dollars had been routed away from facility management and funneled into a network of independent contracting firms. The invoices listed vague services like strategic consulting, branding initiatives, and internal operational audits. "Who owns these contractors?" I asked, though a cold sickness in my stomach already anticipated the answer. "Shell companies," Greer said, her eyes meeting mine in the dim light of the car. "All tracing back to holding entities managed by Celeste Rowan. She has been bleeding the infrastructure budget to fund her own private consulting network. As a result, the roofs in Savannah are rotting. The loading docks in Memphis are violating federal safety compliance codes. Stonegate is in material breach of the master lease across the board." I felt the air thin out in the back of the car. Everett had not just betrayed our marriage. He had pillaged my family assets to finance the woman he planned to replace me with. "It gets much worse," Greer continued, handing me a copy of Stonegate's latest debt issuance prospectus. "Read the risk disclosure regarding operational infrastructure." I read the highlighted paragraph. Everett had described the 6 hubs to the public market as assets under permanent, secured, long-term corporate control. He had deliberately obscured the fact that the entire logistical network was leased, and worse, he hid that those leases were currently in default due to his own financial diversion. "He lied to the institutional investors," I whispered, the sheer scale of the fraud sinking into my bones. "He lied to the banks. It is textbook securities fraud and misrepresentation to lenders," Greer confirmed. He painted a picture of absolute stability. The market thinks Stonegate is an impenetrable fortress. In reality, the entire operation depends entirely on your continued goodwill. I looked at the black binder, then at the $50 million transfer receipt still glowing on my phone screen. Suddenly, the timeline of the evening made perfect, terrifying sense. "This is why you made him wire the money tonight," I said, "before we did anything else." "Exactly," Greer said, snapping the binder shut. "If I had served his executive board with the lease violation notices this morning, the banks would have panicked instantly. The lenders would have immediately frozen Stonegate's credit lines. Everett's shares would have been pledged. Corporate accounts would have been locked down by federal regulators, and you would have never seen a single dime of that settlement. I needed his liquid cash secured in your protected account before we brought the whole structure down." I leaned my head back against the cool leather seat. For years, I had convinced myself that I was merely the supportive wife, the quiet force behind a great man. Everett had constantly reinforced that narrative, treating me like a relic of his past while he paraded his inflated success to the world. He strutted through boardrooms, believing he was a titan. But looking at the documents in my lap, the truth washed over me with the force of a tidal wave. Everett was not a titan. He was a tenant, and his rent was devastatingly past due. He had spent his entire career standing on a launch pad that I had built, that I owned, and that I had let him borrow. He thought he was untouchable because he controlled the corporate board and the media narrative. He forgot who controlled the concrete beneath his feet. "I have the default notices already drafted," Greer said, her voice cutting through the hum of the tires on the highway. "I also have formal demands for a full forensic audit of the maintenance funds. I am ready to notify the board of directors that their core infrastructure network is about to be legally severed." A profound, icy calm settled over me. The pain of the betrayal, the sting of the public humiliation at the gala, it all evaporated. Replaced by a crystalline focus, I was finally awake. "We are not just going to send legal letters," I said, my voice steady and unfamiliar to my own ears. "We are going to completely dismantle the lie he sold to the world. If we pull the leases immediately, the stock drops to zero," Greer warned, playing the role of the devil's advocate perfectly. "The company goes into receivership. It will be a bloodbath." I looked out the window. We were passing the massive industrial outskirts of the city, where thousands of workers were clocking into night shifts at logistics centers exactly like the ones I owned. I thought about the terminal managers, the dispatchers, and the forklift operators who kept the American supply chain moving. "Everett deserves to lose absolutely everything," I said quietly. "Celeste deserves to face a federal indictment for vendor diversion. But there are thousands of employees who rely on Stonegate to feed their families. They did not lie to the Securities and Exchange Commission. They did not steal from my trust." I turned to face my daughter. The corporate attorney in her recognized the fundamental shift in my posture. I was no longer the aggrieved spouse trying to survive a divorce. I was the landlord preparing for a hostile eviction. "We will bring the hammer down on Everett and his executives," I told her, finalizing the strategy in my mind. "But we must build a secondary structure to catch the operational network when Stonegate shatters. Everett will fall. But I refuse to let thousands of innocent workers die in his wreckage." The morning sun cut sharply through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Stonegate Corridor Systems executive boardroom. It was exactly 9 o'clock. Inside the expansive room, the expanded executive committee had already gathered. Through the transparent walls, I could see Everett standing at the head of the massive mahogany table. He was in his element, utilizing his practiced, charismatic baritone to control the narrative. Seated immediately to his right was Celeste. She had abandoned the stark white from the night before, opting instead for a soft, tailored pastel blouse. She was actively playing the role of the modern, stabilizing force, the fresh female face of leadership. Everett was undoubtedly pitching our sudden divorce not as a scandal, but as a civilized transition toward a brighter corporate future. I did not wait for an invitation. I did not knock. I simply pushed the heavy glass doors open and walked in. I wore a sharply tailored burgundy suit. It was the color of dried blood and absolute authority. I walked past the row of senior vice presidents and regional directors as if I had never vacated my invisible seat at that table. Greer walked one step behind me, her expression a mask of pure professional ice, carrying a thick stack of legal portfolios. The low murmur of Everett's speech died instantly. The silence in the room was so sudden and profound that the hum of the overhead projector sounded like a jet engine. Celeste was the first to react. She stood up, her serene mask slipping just enough to reveal the panic underneath. "Security," Celeste commanded, her voice high and tight, gesturing toward the guards stationed in the outer hallway. "Please escort them out. They have no business being here. They no longer have any relevant standing in this building." I did not even look at her. I kept my eyes entirely on the men sitting around the table. Many of them were executives I had personally vetted, hired, and mentored over the past decade. They did not move. They did not call for security. They simply stared, caught in the sudden, violent shift of atmospheric pressure. Greer stepped forward and dropped the heavy stack of portfolios directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table. The loud smack made several executives physically jump. These are formal notices of material breach of contract for all 6 strategic facilities currently occupied by Stonegate Corridor Systems, Greer announced, her voice ringing with the clarity of a tolling bell. She slid a copy toward the company's general counsel. "You have now been formally served." Everett's face contorted into a mask of patronizing disbelief. He leaned his palms on the table, trying to project total control. "Bianca, what on earth are you doing?" Everett sighed, shaking his head slowly as if dealing with a hysterical child. He looked around at his board members, offering them a weary, apologetic smile. "Gentlemen, please forgive this interruption. As you can imagine, emotions are running incredibly high today. My ex-wife is simply struggling to process the personal changes we finalized last night." He was trying to shrink me. He was trying to shove me back into the box of the bitter, discarded spouse throwing a tantrum in front of the adults. I stepped up to the table, placing my hands flat against the cool wood. I leaned in, forcing Everett to meet my gaze. "Stonegate has exactly 72 hours, I stated. My tone was devoid of anger. It was purely transactional, which made it infinitely more terrifying. The apologetic smile vanished from Everett's face. 72 hours for what?" he snapped. 72 hours to hand over the complete, unredacted records of the structural maintenance funds for all 6 properties, I replied, my voice slicing through the stale boardroom air. 72 hours to surrender every subcontractor agreement signed in the last 36 months. And 72 hours to provide a line-by-line justification for every single expenditure routed to any corporate entity affiliated with Celeste Rowan. At the mention of her name, Celeste dropped back into her leather chair as if she had been shot. "If those documents are not delivered to my legal team by Monday morning," I continued, refusing to yield a single inch of ground, "the Hathaway Corridor Trust will activate the default termination clause. We will revoke your access, lock the gates, and legally repossess all 6 premises." The boardroom erupted into chaos. 2 of the regional directors started whispering furiously to each other. The chief operating officer dragged a hand down his face, his complexion turning a sickly shade of gray. Everett slammed his fist onto the table, the sharp crack silencing the room once more. "You cannot do that," Everett roared, the veneer of the civilized chief executive completely shattering. "You are bluffing. You would never destroy your own income stream just to settle a petty domestic grudge." "Do not insult my intelligence by calling this a domestic grudge," I fired back, my voice rising just enough to command absolute dominance. "This is a strictly commercial dispute. Under Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Master Lease Agreement, you are required to maintain a dedicated escrow account for structural integrity. You have missed your funding obligations for 29 consecutive months. You have violated the core covenants of our partnership." Everett pointed a shaking finger at me. "I built this company. I control the freight. You just hold the paper." Greer stepped in, her legal instincts taking over. She did not raise her voice. She simply weaponized her vocabulary. "The paper is the only thing keeping you out of federal prison." "Everett," Greer said, looking directly at the independent directors seated at the far end of the table, "I strongly suggest the board reviews the recent debt issuance prospectus. If the maintenance funds were diverted to related party vendors without proper disclosure, this board is currently presiding over a massive misrepresentation to lenders. We are talking about severe related party disclosure failures. When the commercial banks find out you pledged leased, defaulting assets as permanent collateral, they will call your loans by the end of the business day." I watched the faces of the independent board members. These were men who cared about their own wealth and their own legal immunity. When Greer dropped the phrases, "misrepresentation to lenders," and "related party disclosure failure," the temperature in the room plummeted. They were no longer looking at Everett with respect. They were looking at him like he was a live grenade. Everett saw the shift. He saw his grip on the room slipping away in real time. Panic flared in his eyes, but he tried to mask it with aggressive bravado. He turned abruptly to his general counsel, a quiet, sweating man sitting near the projector. "File an emergency injunction immediately," Everett ordered, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Get a judge on the phone right now. Draft a motion to compel her to maintain the leases. Cite the public interest. Cite the preservation of worker rights. Tell the court she is attempting a hostile disruption of the national supply chain out of sheer malice." The general counsel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at the breach of contract notices lying on the table, realizing the legal nightmare that had just landed in his lap. I straightened my posture, buttoning the center button of my burgundy jacket. I had delivered the message. I had set the clock. There was nothing left to do but let them suffocate in the panic I had just introduced. I turned my back on Everett and began to walk toward the glass doors. Before stepping out into the hallway, I paused and looked over my shoulder. The entire room was frozen, hanging on my final move. "I will not burn the company down," I said, my voice steady, echoing clearly across the expansive room. "But I will also not continue to be the floor a liar stands on to step on my face." I walked out of the boardroom. Greer followed right behind me. We did not speak as we marched down the long, carpeted corridor, past the rows of cubicles and staring employees. We stepped into the executive elevator, and the stainless steel doors slid shut, cutting us off from the corporate empire I had just placed on life support. As the elevator began its rapid descent to the ground floor, the tense silence between us was broken by a soft vibration. Greer reached into the pocket of her trench coat and pulled out her phone. She stared at the illuminated screen for a long moment. A slow, predatory smile touched the corners of her mouth. She turned the phone so I could read the glowing text message. It was from an encrypted number, but the sender's identity was obvious. It was the senior independent board member, the older gentleman who had turned pale during the meeting. The message was brief, containing only a single, devastating sentence. "If you have proof of vendor diversion, send it before the banks ask." By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my smartphone transformed into a weapon aimed directly at my chest. The first alert was a push notification from a prominent financial tabloid. Within 45 minutes, a synchronized smear campaign detonated across every major social media platform and industry message board. They had deployed a meticulously crafted narrative designed to annihilate my public standing. I was no longer the silent architect of a logistics empire. I was suddenly painted as a wealthy, voracious, and deeply selfish woman who was actively threatening the livelihoods of thousands of blue-collar workers simply because I was jealous of my husband's younger, vibrant new partner. The digital assault was brutally efficient. A leaked video from the gala began circulating rapidly. It had been heavily doctored and spliced. The edited footage completely removed Greer's commanding entrance and her dismantling of Everett's financial bluff. Instead, it showed Everett standing at the table, looking incredibly weary and magnanimously offering me the settlement. It cut to Celeste, casting her eyes downward in a display of manufactured humility. Finally, the camera zoomed in on my face as I stared at the $50 million check with a cold, unyielding expression. The caption plastered across the bottom of the video read, "Wife demands more after rejecting a $50 million fortune. Threatens to shut down shipping routes." Shortly after the video went viral, Celeste updated her professional social media profiles. She posted a stark, text-only image against a minimalist background. It read, "True leadership means protecting the future of our company and our dedicated workforce from toxic, vindictive elements of the past." It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive corporate communication. She was positioning herself as the savior of the working class while actively sleeping with the man who was bankrupting their infrastructure. Sitting in the dim light of our temporary hotel suite, I felt a sharp, suffocating ache in my chest. The sheer injustice of the public humiliation threatened to pull me under. I had spent 2 decades protecting that man's reputation, and he was using the very wealth I helped generate to finance a public smear campaign against me. Greer, however, did not flinch. She sat cross-legged on the sofa, her laptop glowing brightly against her face, completely ignoring the comment sections filled with vitriol. "Do not read the comments," Greer ordered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "This is not organic outrage. Look at the deployment speed. Look at the uniformity of the phrasing across disparate platforms. This is a purchase narrative. They are trying to force you into a defensive public relations battle." "It is working," I murmured, watching another news alert flash across the television screen on silent. "Only if we engage on their terms," Greer replied, her eyes narrowing as she pulled up a terminal window filled with lines of code. "I am tracking the origin of the initial video drop. The seeding accounts all share identical network footprints. They are being managed by a centralized digital marketing firm." She hit a final keystroke, and a corporate registry document populated on the screen. "Rowan Strategic Media," Greer read aloud, a grim satisfaction settling over her features. "It is a boutique consulting firm registered in Delaware. The primary beneficiary is Celeste Rowan. Everett is not just letting his mistress run his brand department. He is using company funds to pay her private firm to run a coordinated defamation campaign against you, before we could even begin to draft a strategy to expose the PR funding." Greer's encrypted mobile line rang. It was an unidentified number. She put it on speakerphone and placed it on the glass coffee table between us. "Greer Hathaway," she answered, her tone instantly dropping into a professional chill. "My name is Madeline Keel." A sharp, slightly breathless voice crackled through the speaker. "I was the financial controller for Stonegate Corridor Systems until I was forced into an early resignation 8 months ago. I saw the tabloids today. I saw what your father is trying to do to your mother." I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. I remembered Madeline. She was a brilliant, uncompromising accountant. Everett had always complained that she lacked creative vision. "Why are you calling, Madeline?" Greer asked, cutting straight to the point. "Because Everett is a fraud, and I'm tired of watching him destroy women to protect his balance sheet," Madeline stated, her voice hardening with unresolved anger. "I am sending a secure encrypted file drop to your email address right now. I retained copies of the internal ledgers before they locked me out of the enterprise software." A soft chime sounded from Greer's laptop. She opened the secure link. Rows upon rows of dense financial data flooded the screen. "I was fired because I refused to sign off on a series of highly irregular disbursements," Madeline explained over the phone. "Look at the vendor accounts for Ashford Drayage and Vale Cross Dock Services." Greer isolated the two accounts. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars had been funneled to these specific regional freight contractors over the past 2 years. "Their billing rates are utterly absurd," Greer observed, scanning the invoices. "They are charging triple the market average for standard container shuffling. Why did procurement approve this?" "Because they are not independent contractors," Madeline revealed. "Ashford Drayage is owned by Celeste Rowan's cousin. Vale Cross Dock Services is registered to a holding company controlled by her brother-in-law. Everett authorized those inflated contracts directly. He bypassed the standard procurement reviews." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Suddenly, a dozen small, seemingly insignificant memories from the past 3 years violently aligned in my mind. I remembered standing in the foyer of our home, holding a stack of budget variance reports, asking Everett why our transportation costs were spiking despite lower fuel prices. He had physically taken the folders out of my hands, closed his office door in my face, and told me, "You do not need to care about the dirty part of growth. Leave the operational messy work to me." I remembered him firing our veteran director of operations and replacing him with a younger executive who had been personally recommended by Celeste. "This is not just an affair that bled into the corporate structure," Greer said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as she connected the dots. "This is an organized embezzlement network. They have been siphoning corporate revenue under the disguise of a domestic supplier restructuring program." "Exactly," Madeline confirmed. "They inflated the invoices, paid Celeste's family members, and pocketed the difference." "But it gets much worse." "Show me," Greer demanded. "Open the facility maintenance tab for the Savannah location." Madeline instructed. Greer clicked into the specific spreadsheet. The columns dedicated to structural repair and safety compliance were completely zeroed out for the last 4 quarters. 2 months before I was fired, Madeline said, her voice trembling slightly with remembered dread. The Savannah warehouse faced a surprise federal safety inspection. We almost failed. We were 1 citation away from the government shutting down the entire southeastern corridor. Why? I asked, speaking for the first time, horrified by the operational risk. Because the roof was failing, Madeline answered bluntly. The moisture control systems in Sector 4 had completely collapsed. We had millions of dollars of temperature-sensitive cargo sitting under a leaking roof. The container sealing mechanisms were heavily rusted and non-compliant. I submitted an emergency funding request to fix the infrastructure. Everett denied it. He told me the maintenance budget was empty. Where did the money go? Greer asked, though she already knew the answer. He drained the reserve accounts to pay Rowan Strategic Media for a year-long strategic communications retainer, Madeline said. He risked a federal shutdown. He risked the safety of the dock workers. And he risked the cargo of his largest clients, just to ensure his mistress had a slush fund. The call ended shortly after, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the hotel room. The news cycle on the television was still running the doctored video, still broadcasting the lie that I was the monster trying to break the company. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking down at the bustling Boston streets below. The media was trying to turn my divorce into a cheap, dramatic soap opera. Everett thought he was fighting a public relations battle about a broken marriage. He thought the worst thing I could do was demand half of his liquid assets. He was entirely wrong. He had not just cheated on his wife. He had compromised the structural integrity of a national supply chain to finance a criminal conspiracy. The anger inside me refined itself, burning away the last traces of grief and leaving behind a colder, harder clarity. I did not just want to clear my name anymore. I wanted to drag Everett Sloan and Celeste Rowan out into the brutal light of day and watch their entire fraudulent empire collapse under the weight of their own ledgers. The air inside the heritage dining room of the Commonwealth Club was thick with the scent of aged leather and burning birchwood. It was an exclusive sanctuary for the old money elite of the city, a place where multi-billion-dollar acquisitions were finalized over crystal glasses of single malt scotch. It was also the exact room where Everett had proposed to me over 2 decades ago. He had chosen this location for our private meeting with deliberate, calculated precision. He wanted to drag me back into the soft, sentimental territory of our past. He wanted to weaponize my nostalgia. When Greer and I arrived at the secluded corner booth, Everett was already seated. He had abandoned the sharp, aggressive bespoke suits he wore in the boardroom and at the gala. Today, he wore a soft charcoal cashmere sweater. He looked noticeably older, his shoulders slumped, his eyes carrying heavy, dark circles. He was actively shedding the skin of the ruthless corporate conqueror and slipping effortlessly into the role of the exhausted, pressured man who had simply lost his way. "Thank you for coming," Everett said, his voice a low, raspy murmur. He did not look at Greer. He focused entirely on me, projecting an aura of profound vulnerability. "I know I have no right to ask for your time after the way I behaved on Friday night." I sat across from him. I did not order a drink. I folded my hands on the pristine white tablecloth and simply watched him. I did not interrupt. "The pressure of running Stonegate has been tearing me apart from the inside out," Everett continued, leaning forward, his eyes searching mine for the familiar empathy I had always freely given him. "The board of directors is constantly demanding impossible growth margins. The institutional investors are breathing down my neck every single quarter. I was drowning. Bianca. Celeste was not a grand romance. She was a lapse in judgment. She was a momentary escape from a reality that was crushing me. Stonegate just needs a little more time to stabilize. And I need you. You are the only person in this world who truly understands the weight I carry." I listened to his monologue without a single shift in my expression. For the first time in my life, I was completely immune to his frequency. Sitting in that dim, quiet room, A terrifying realization washed over me. The most dangerous thing about Everett was never his explosive temper or his arrogance. It was his breathtaking ability to switch masks. He could pivot from a cruel, mocking tyrant to a broken, pleading victim so fast that it created a psychological whiplash. He was a master at making the person sitting across from him feel as though they were the one being unreasonable, as though they were the one overreacting to his betrayals. When my silence stretched on, offering him no comfort, the soft facade began to crack just slightly at the edges. He cleared his throat and reached into his leather briefcase. "I want to make this right," Everett said, his tone shifting back toward the transactional, though still coated in faux warmth. He pulled out a thick, legal document bound in a blue cover and pushed it across the table. "I am putting a new offer on the table. $80 million in clean, untethered liquid assets. I am also offering you an honorary lifetime seat on the Stonegate Charitable Foundation Board. You will maintain your public standing, your philanthropic influence, and your dignity." He paused, tapping his index finger against the cover of the document. "In exchange, I need you to sign a comprehensive lifetime non-disclosure agreement regarding our internal operations. Furthermore, the Hathaway Corridor Trust must formally retract the breach of contract notices and grant Stonegate a guaranteed lease extension of 3 years on all 6 strategic facilities." He thought he was negotiating from a position of temporary weakness. He thought he was throwing money at a problem to make it disappear. He did not realize the ground beneath him had already collapsed, before I could even formulate a rejection. Greer reached across the table. She placed her hand flat over the blue legal folder and pushed it firmly back toward her father. "My mother declines your offer," Greer stated, her voice as hard and smooth as polished marble. Everett's jaw tightened. The cashmere sweater suddenly looked very out of place on a man radiating such sudden, barely contained hostility. "I am speaking to my wife, Greer, not her attorney. This is a family matter." "There is no family left here," Greer replied smoothly, opening her laptop and turning the screen so Everett could see the displayed financial logs. "And this is no longer a negotiation about marital assets. We are declining the $80 million because you do not actually have the capital to pay it, just like you did not have the capital to pay the $50 million on Friday night." Everett froze. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. "We spent the entire night tracing the wire transfer you authorized during the gala," Greer explained, her words precise and surgical. "That $50 million did not come from Stonegate's free cash flow. It did not come from your personal executive compensation packages. It was pulled directly from a restricted reserve account tied to the operational stability covenants in your primary commercial credit agreements." I watched Everett's hands begin to tremble. He quickly pulled them off the table and hid them in his lap. "You did not just use company funds to buy a divorce settlement," Greer continued, twisting the blade with relentless calm. "You emptied the corporate fire bucket to put out your own personal fire. That restricted account is legally ring-fenced. It exists solely to ensure the company can survive a catastrophic supply chain failure. By draining it for a personal legal settlement, you have committed a massive, undeniable event of default. If the syndicate of banks financing your debt discovers this, they have the legal right to call in the entirety of Stonegate's loans by tomorrow morning." Everett could not breathe. He was suffocating on his own arrogance. He had thought he was so untouchable that he could treat a publicly traded company's emergency reserves as his own personal checking account. "But that is not the only thing we found," Greer said, pulling a printed stack of emails from her bag and dropping them next to his rejected offer. "You claim Celeste was just a lapse in judgment. You claim she was just an escape. Yet, she has been remarkably busy for a mere distraction." Greer tapped the top email. "These are internal communications retrieved from the corporate servers. Celeste Rowan personally signed the authorization vouchers for the inflated invoices submitted by Ashford Drayage. She funneled millions of dollars of corporate revenue to her own family members." She slid another piece of paper toward him. "And this is a direct email from Celeste to your chief operating officer, sent 2 weeks ago. I will read it for you. We need to accelerate the replacement of the current infrastructure partner. Push the wife out and secure the facilities before the institutional lenders begin their quarterly debt review. She was not just your mistress. She was your co-conspirator in a systematic scheme to defraud your shareholders and strip this company for parts. Everett stared at the emails. The mask of the victim was gone. The mask of the conqueror was gone. There was nothing left but the hollow, terrified stare of a man who had finally run out of runway. I looked at him, and the final illusion I held about our marriage dissolved into nothing. I felt an incredible sense of weightlessness. For years, I had agonized over what I had done wrong, why I was not enough, why he had looked elsewhere. But seeing him cornered, stripped of his lies and his leverage, I finally saw the absolute emptiness of the man I had loved. Everett did not want a family. He did not want genuine love. He did not even care about the long-term survival of the company he claimed to have built. The only thing Everett Sloane had ever wanted was power without the burden of consequences. I stood up from the booth. I did not feel the need to yell. I did not feel the need to hurl insults. He was already a ghost to me. "You can keep your $80 million, I told him, looking down at his pathetic, slumped figure. "You are going to need every single penny to pay for your federal defense attorneys." I turned and walked away, leaving him sitting in the shadows of the club where he had once promised me the world. Greer walked shoulder to shoulder with me as we exited the heavy brass doors and stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the afternoon. The city moved around us, completely unaware of the empire that was currently bleeding to death in the dining room behind us. Greer stopped on the sidewalk, pulling the collar of her coat up against the wind. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the cold, hard light of the city. "Mom, we are no longer looking for proof of how bad he is," Greer said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute finality. "We are looking for proof of how criminal he is. If I release the encrypted ledgers to the federal regulators tomorrow morning, Stonegate corridor systems would not just fall, it would collapse all at once. The stock price would plummet to zero before the opening bell. The commercial banks would instantly freeze the operating accounts, triggering a cascading, irreversible default. Thousands of warehouse workers, truck drivers, dispatchers, and mid-level managers would find themselves locked out of their livelihoods, their health insurance voided overnight. And Everett would crawl out from under the wreckage, hire an elite crisis management firm, and spend the rest of his life telling the world that his hysterical, jealous ex-wife burned down an American logistics institution simply because she could not handle being replaced by a younger woman. I refused to give him that narrative. I did not just want to win this war. I wanted to choose exactly how I won. Sitting in the hotel suite, which had now become our permanent strategic command center, Greer and I engineered a comprehensive two-tier strategy. The first tier was the A financial and legal mechanism aimed directly at Everett and his mistress, meant exclusively for Everett and his mistress. The second tier, however, was a meticulously crafted safety net designed to catch the innocent people caught in the blast radius of his monumental fraud. I instructed Greer to initiate contact with the managing partners of a massive infrastructure private equity fund based in New York. 2 decades ago, long before Everett became the untouchable logistics king on the covers of financial magazines, I was the one sitting across the table from those exact partners, negotiating the initial capital leases that kept his fledgling trucking company alive. They respected my operational discipline and my foresight long before they ever knew my husband's name. Simultaneously, Greer quietly opened a back channel with the syndicate of commercial banks holding Stonegate's massive debt portfolio. Banks inherently despise chaos. They would much rather transition their debt obligations to a stable, newly capitalized entity than watch a publicly traded company plunge into a messy multi-year bankruptcy liquidation process. I outlined the new corporate architecture for them. We would call it the Hathaway Freight Continuum. It was a completely clean, ring-fenced acquisition vehicle. The terms I presented to the private equity fund and the lenders were absolute. This continuum would only be activated the exact moment the corporate board of directors stripped Everett of his executive authority. Once he was removed from power, my trust would seamlessly transfer the leases of the strategic hubs to the new entity. The private equity fund would bridge the immediate capital gap, and we would retain every single frontline worker and terminal manager. We would save the operational network, but we would surgically amputate the infection at the highest level of leadership while we were quietly building a lifeboat. Everett was desperately trying to sink the entire ship. On Wednesday afternoon, his aggressive legal team filed an emergency injunction in the federal civil court. He was bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted financial wounds, but he still possessed the audacity to play the ultimate victim. His legal petition was a masterpiece of corporate fiction. He argued before the judge that the 6 massive transit properties held by the Hathaway Corridor Trust were not independent entity holdings at all, but rather marital assets that I had deviously hidden inside legal shells during our marriage. He petitioned the federal court to issue an immediate, binding order forcing me to maintain the active leases. He cited the absolute necessity to protect shareholder value, preserve the stability of the national supply chain, and protect the rights of the American worker. It was sickening. He was trying to wrap himself in the flag of public interest, using the very workers he had actively endangered in Savannah as human shields to protect his crumbling, fraudulent empire. The pressure was mounting to an absolute breaking point. We were less than 24 hours away from the preliminary injunction hearing, where Everett planned to drag my name through the judicial mud. Then, the foundation of his defense cracked entirely from the inside. It started with a secure, encrypted text message sent to Greer's phone late in the evening. The sender was Owen Mercer, the current chief financial officer of Stonegate. Owen was a brilliant numbers man, but he was inherently cautious, a corporate survivor who had always kept his head down and avoided Everett's explosive wrath. But Everett had finally pushed him entirely too far into the criminal abyss. "I cannot keep signing these false certifications," Owen wrote in his initial message. He was terrified. He knew with absolute certainty that when the federal regulators finally audited the books, his signature would be resting right next to Everett's on every single fraudulent public filing. Greer engaged him immediately, utilizing her sharpest restructuring attorney persona. She offered him a highly specific window of legal protection if he provided actionable intelligence before we walked into the federal courthouse the next morning. Owen was not quite ready to fully betray his chief executive officer just yet. He was still desperately clinging to the fragile hope that the company could quietly settle the accounting discrepancies behind closed doors. But his profound fear of federal prison ultimately overrode his corporate loyalty. He leaked a single, catastrophic detail that completely shattered Everett's remaining legal defenses. Owen confessed that Everett had not just authorized the inflated, absurd payments to Celeste's family members. When the independent auditors started asking difficult questions during the previous quarter, Everett had panicked. To cover his tracks, he had personally backdated the internal vendor approval minutes. Even worse, he had completely forged the board of directors' consent signatures to legally justify the massive capital drain to Rowan Strategic Media. I read the text messages over Greer's shoulder, a cold, crystalline clarity settling deep into my bones. This was no longer a bitter, emotional feud between a discarded wife and a cheating husband. That narrative felt incredibly small, almost trivial, compared to the reality of the situation. This was the defining moment where I had to step forward as the only actual adult in the room. Everett was behaving like a cornered, rabid animal, entirely willing to forge legal documents, lie to federal judges, and bankrupt a massive, dedicated workforce just to protect his own inflated ego and his mistress's bank account. I realized I was the only person sober enough to execute the necessary triage. I had to rescue what was truly worth saving and ruthlessly bury what absolutely needed to be buried. The preliminary injunction hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. Everett genuinely thought he was going to walk into that mahogany courtroom and use his high-priced corporate litigators to bully me into total submission. He believed the American legal system would blindly protect his wealth and his title. He thought I was just a woman scorned, entirely incapable of understanding the lethal mechanics of corporate warfare. At exactly midnight, the screen of Greer's phone illuminated the dark hotel room one last time. It was a final, definitive message from Owen Mercer. Sitting alone in the dark, the chief financial officer had finally made his choice. Tomorrow, I will not lie for him anymore. The federal courthouse in downtown Boston felt heavy with the weight of institutional authority. The air inside the courtroom was stale, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical tapping of the court reporter documenting every single breath. We were here for an emergency injunction hearing. Everett had filed the motion in a desperate attempt to force me to allow Stonegate Corridor Systems to continue occupying my 6 strategic facilities, while our divorce and asset disputes played out in the public eye. Everett stood at the plaintiff's table, wearing a conservative navy blue suit designed to make him look like a reliable statesman of industry. He addressed the presiding judge with the practiced, melodic cadence of a man who was entirely accustomed to being believed. "Your Honor," Everett began, placing a hand over his heart in a sickening display of earnestness, "I have spent 20 years building this logistics network from a single truck into a publicly traded pillar of the American supply chain. My ex-wife, however, is currently attempting to use an obscure, historical legal structure to completely paralyze our operations. She is not acting as a rational commercial landlord. She is acting out of deep personal grievance. She is feeling abandoned, and she is using these property deeds to exact a ruthless, vindictive revenge that will ultimately cost thousands of innocent people their livelihoods." Sitting 2 rows behind him in the gallery was Celeste. She had dressed specifically for the cameras outside. She wore a high-necked, soft gray cardigan, her hair pulled back simply. She kept her gaze tilted downward, occasionally lifting a stark white tissue to the corner of her eye. She was perfectly executing the role of the saintly, innocent woman who was being unfairly targeted by an unstable, jealous predecessor. She wanted the room to feel sorry for her. Greer sat beside me at the defense table. She did not roll her eyes. She did not object to his theatrical, emotional monologue. She simply waited for him to finish. When it was her turn to address the court, she did not argue with feelings. She argued with concrete. Greer approached the bench pushing a small, rolling metal cart stacked high with perfectly organized legal binders. "Your Honor," Greer stated, her voice projecting a cold, clinical authority that instantly commanded the room. "Opposing counsel is attempting to litigate a messy domestic dispute. We are here strictly to litigate a commercial eviction based on severe documented financial delinquency." She handed the first heavy folder to the clerk. Exhibit A is the unbroken chain of title, proving the Hathaway Corridor Trust possesses sole, unencumbered ownership of the 6 properties in question. Exhibit B is the original master lease agreement. She pulled another thick stack of paper from the cart. Exhibit C contains the structural maintenance addendums, and Exhibit D contains the certified default notices, alongside formal letters from commercial insurance underwriters threatening to drop coverage due to catastrophic facility neglect. We are not evicting Stonegate Corridor Systems out of spite. We are evicting them because they have been in material breach of their core financial obligations for multiple consecutive financial quarters. Every single document Greer handed over landed like a physical hammer blow against Everett's carefully constructed narrative. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the statesman persona beginning to crack under the sheer volume of undeniable evidence. The judge reviewed the files, his brow furrowing as he read through the insurance warnings. He looked over the top of his reading glasses, fixing his gaze directly on me. He asked if I fully comprehended the massive economic disruption that would occur if he allowed me to lock the gates of 6 major intermodal hubs. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my tailored jacket. I looked at the judge, and then I let my eyes briefly lock onto Everett. "Your Honor," I said, my voice perfectly steady, entirely drained of the grief and humiliation that had once paralyzed me. "I am not standing in your courtroom today to ask for your permission to exact personal revenge. I am intimately aware of the economic scale of these facilities. That is precisely why I leased them to Stonegate at a fraction of their market value for 2 solid decades. But I am here right now because I absolutely refuse to continue subsidizing a corporate entity with my private, generational assets. I will not provide a discount to a system that has utilized systemic fraud to humiliate me publicly and deceive its own institutional investors. The courtroom fell dead silent. I had just introduced the word fraud into a federal record. Everett's defense attorneys began whispering furiously among themselves. The judge struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block. He was clearly unimpressed by Everett's victim routine, but he was also a pragmatic jurist who refused to trigger a national supply chain crisis on a Thursday morning. He did not grant Everett the permanent, coercive injunction he so desperately needed. However, he also denied my request for an immediate, same-day eviction. Instead, the judge issued a strict 48-hour standstill order. Neither party will alter the current operational access for the next 48 hours, the judge commanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. However, during this exact window, I am legally compelling Stonegate Corridor Systems to surrender the entirety of their financial ledgers to the defense. You will produce the complete structural maintenance fund accounting. You will produce the precise origination account data for the $50 million wire transfer executed last Friday, and you will surrender every single related party contract affiliated with Miss Rowan. We are adjourned. Everett exhaled a massive, visible breath of relief. He slumped back into his chair. In his arrogant mind, avoiding an immediate eviction was a tremendous victory. He genuinely believed he had just successfully bought himself enough time to manipulate the internal records or secure a backdoor bridge loan to cover his tracks. As the courtroom emptied, we walked out into the expansive marble corridor. A dense swarm of financial reporters and local news crews immediately blocked the exit, their cameras flashing aggressively. Celeste stepped right up to the cluster of microphones. She offered a brave, weary smile to the flashing lenses. We are simply grateful that the federal court recognized the absolute necessity of protecting our dedicated workers today, Celeste said softly, adopting a tone of profound civic duty. We firmly believe the truth is leaning towards Stonegate, and we look forward to moving past this unfortunate distraction. I ignored the cameras entirely. I kept my chin high and walked straight through the crowd toward the security checkpoint. Greer marched right beside me, shielding my flank. The hallway was chaotic, filled with shouting reporters and pushing security guards. As we navigated the bottleneck near the exit doors, a man in a rumpled tan trench coat brushed violently against Greer's shoulder. It looked like an accident caused by the surging crowd, but the man was Owen Mercer. The chief financial officer did not stop walking. He did not apologize. He did not even make eye contact with us. But in that brief fraction of a second of physical collision, he subtly slipped a heavy metallic object directly into the deep outer pocket of Greer's wool coat. We did not speak until we were safely secured in the back of our private town car, the dark-tinted windows shielding us from the street outside. Greer reached into her pocket and pulled out the object. It was a compact, encrypted solid-state hard drive. She opened her laptop resting on her knees and immediately plugged the drive into the port. Owen had delivered exactly what he promised, and significantly more. He had downloaded the raw, unalterable treasury logs. The data confirmed with absolute mathematical certainty that the $50 million transferred to my blind trust account had been illegally drained directly from the restricted commercial credit reserve. But the most devastating piece of evidence on the drive was not a spreadsheet. It was an audio file. Owen had secretly recorded an internal executive steering committee meeting from 3 weeks ago. Greer clicked play. The sound of Everett's voice filled the quiet space of the car. It was not the soft, pleading voice from the club, nor the statesman from the courtroom. It was the arrogant, careless voice of a man who thought he owned the world. I do not care what the compliance manual says. Owen, Everett's recorded voice snapped angrily. Use the restricted reserve. Just pay Bianca whatever she demands to get the facility signatures. We have to finish this divorce off and lock down the real estate before the lenders review the collateral file next week. Greer paused the audio. She then opened a related email chain saved right next to the recording. It was an email from Celeste to the finance department, completely bypassing standard approval protocols. Push the vendor invoices through immediately, Celeste had written. We need to clear these accounts and accelerate the replacement of the wife before the auditors arrive. Everett thought he had bought time today. He thought he was currently negotiating a complex legal maze. But staring at the screen, we knew the truth. He was already buried. He just did not know he was dead yet. Greer safely ejected the hard drive and carefully closed the lid of her laptop. She looked out the window at the passing city skyline, a landscape dominated by the very corporations her father was trying to emulate. Then, she turned her sharp, calculating eyes back to me. "Mom," Greer said, her voice completely devoid of hesitation or fear. "Today was just a knock on the door. The real blow comes at the annual shareholder meeting this weekend The 48-hour standstill order issued by the federal judge did not freeze time. It compressed it into a suffocating, high-pressure tunnel of pure adrenaline. We did not sleep. Our temporary hotel suite completely transformed into a corporate war room. Greer commandeered the massive mahogany dining table, drowning the polished wood in stacks of legal filings, printed email chains, and the complex structural blueprints for our new takeover entity. I sat directly across from her, my eyes burning from the harsh blue light of the laptop screen, meticulously filtering the massive data dumps provided by our newest informant. We were engaging in extreme corporate triage. We had to separate the parts of the logistics network that could be saved from the parts corrupted by his decisions. Owen Mercer did not just give us the wire transfer logs to save his own skin. He gave us a full internal map of a company already in deep structural decline. As I cross-referenced the internal treasury records against the public shareholder reports, the sheer magnitude of the deception became terrifyingly clear. Everett had not merely raided a restricted reserve account to fund his impromptu divorce settlement. He had systematically fabricated the operational health of the entire enterprise for years. The data proved he artificially inflated the warehouse occupancy rates across all 6 major hubs, creating phantom revenue streams on paper by logging ghost pallets and non-existent inventory. He aggressively hid millions of dollars in deferred maintenance debt, leaving the physical infrastructure on the verge of catastrophic failure. Most disgustingly, he utilized the vendor contracts tied to his mistress to funnel corporate liquidity into personal offshore holdings, all executed right before he planned to approach the commercial lenders for a massive debt refinancing package. He was dressing up a rotting corpse and asking the international banks to finance a luxury funeral. The most revealing fracture in his empire, however, did not come from a terrified accountant. It came from the woman who had tried to hand me my walking papers in a minimalist white dress. On Friday afternoon, a courier arrived at our hotel with a thick, heavily sealed envelope addressed directly to my daughter. Inside was a formal legal proposition drafted by an independent, high-priced defense attorney representing Celeste Rowan. The sheer arrogance of the document was staggering. The brand director who had tried to publicly execute my dignity just days prior was now aggressively negotiating for her own survival in the shadows. She demanded absolute legal immunity from any upcoming civil litigation and an ironclad guarantee that we would not hand her over to federal prosecutors. In exchange for saving her own skin, she offered to surrender her personal mobile device and the complete, unedited chain of encrypted text messages between her and Everett. According to her lawyer, those messages contained absolute proof that Everett explicitly knew the $50 million was legally restricted capital, but he ordered her to execute the transfer anyway to expedite his freedom and secure his new life. I did not trust a single syllable that woman spoke, but her betrayal was the ultimate validation of our strategy. Loyalty in their hollow, glittering world was completely transactional. It only survived until the exact moment the concrete threat of a federal prison cell or the loss of their luxurious lifestyle became a tangible reality. Everett had bought her allegiance with stolen money, and now, facing total ruin, she was eagerly selling him out for a severe discount. As the sun began to set on the final day of our legal standstill, My phone vibrated with a direct message from Everett. He begged for one final, entirely private meeting. He did not suggest a sterilized boardroom or a wealthy private club. He asked me to meet him at the old property out by Lake Norman. It was a sprawling, undeveloped plot of forested land we had purchased 2 decades ago, back when he still looked at me with genuine partnership and hunger in his eyes. He had stood on that very dirt, holding my hand, and promised to build our family the ultimate permanent sanctuary. When I pulled my rental car onto the crunching gravel driveway, the evening air was biting and unforgivingly cold. Everett was standing near the edge of the dark water, wrapped in a heavy wool coat. He looked completely defeated, his posture entirely devoid of the boardroom tyrant I had faced all week. He did not yell. He did not threaten me with his aggressive legal team or his purchased public relations firm. He played the absolute last card he had left in his desperate deck. He played the nostalgia card. "We stood right here 20 years ago," Everett said softly, his voice trembling slightly as he looked out over the dark, rippling water. He turned to face me, his eyes wide and pleading, trying to summon the ghost of the man I used to love. "We built every single piece of this together, from one broken, rusted truck to a national empire. Please do not do this. Please do not let these outside investors and corporate vultures tear apart what is rightfully ours. Do not let them steal our legacy." I stood a few feet away from him, the icy wind whipping my coat around my legs. I looked at the man I had spent half my life protecting, funding, and covering for. I searched my own heart for a flicker of hesitation, a single drop of residual pity. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left. There was no sorrow. There was only the freezing, immaculate clarity of absolute truth. "Outsiders did not steal anything from you," I said, my voice possessing the coldest, most unwavering calm I had ever achieved in my entire life. "You invited them in. You gave them the keys. And then you locked me outside." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on him, my heels crunching against the gravel, and walked away. I left him completely alone in the creeping dark, standing on the empty dirt lot where our future had died a very long time ago. I returned to the hotel suite to find Greer finalizing the complex architecture of the Hathaway Freight Continuum. The trap was now perfectly set and armed. The massive infrastructure fund had officially committed the necessary bridge capital in writing. The framework was brilliantly simple, but devastatingly effective. If the corporate board of directors successfully removed Everett from all operational control during the impending shareholder meeting, my trust would immediately revoke the defaulted leases and reissue clean, secure property rights to the newly formed legal entity. The transition would be entirely seamless. The commercial banks would be satisfied and keep the credit lines open. The national supply chain would not experience a single hour of disruption. And most importantly, the vast majority of the frontline operational staff would retain their employment, their hard-earned seniority, and their critical health insurance. The final strike I was about to deliver was no longer the desperate, destructive act of a bitter woman seeking blind revenge. It had evolved into a calculated, necessary surgical procedure. I was stepping up as the only responsible adult, capable of cleaning up the catastrophic mess that Everett had recklessly created in his pursuit of absolute power. It was midnight. We were mere hours away from the annual shareholder meeting, an event that was legally mandated to be live-streamed to thousands of institutional and retail investors across the entire nation. The judicial standstill order would expire precisely as the opening bell rang on Wall Street. I stood quietly by the massive window of our suite, staring out at the glowing, sprawling city skyline, feeling the immense, crushing gravity of the morning to come. Greer walked across the room and stood beside me, her reflection joining mine in the dark glass. She reached out and placed her hand firmly on my shoulder, a gesture of profound respect from an attorney to her most important client. "Tomorrow, do not walk in there like an abandoned wife," Greer said, her voice rich with an ironclad certainty that echoed powerfully through the quiet room. "You walk in there as the true owner of the foundation they have been standing on for 15 years. The annual shareholder meeting convened at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The grand auditorium of the downtown convention center was packed with institutional investors, financial journalists, and nervous corporate officers. High-definition cameras were strategically positioned around the perimeter, broadcasting the event live to thousands of retail investors across the globe. I stood in the darkened vestibule just outside the main doors, listening to the audio feed through a discreet earpiece. On stage, Everett was delivering the performance of a lifetime. He gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, projecting the aura of an unshakable king. He smoothly navigated through the fabricated revenue projections before seamlessly pivoting to the elephant in the room. "I want to address the rumors circulating in the financial press," Everett announced, his voice echoing with practiced sincerity. "Stonegate is currently navigating a temporary family fluctuation. Divorces are inherently messy, and unfortunately, mine has spilled into the public domain. However, I assure you, our core operations remain entirely stable. The executive board and I have absolute 100% control over this situation." That was my cue. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. I did not walk in alone. Greer matched my pace on my right. On my left was the lead managing director of the banking syndicate that held Stonegate's debt. Flanking them were the two senior independent board members, a team of elite restructuring attorneys, and finally, Owen Mercer. The chief financial officer was no longer sitting on Everett's side of the aisle. The temperature in the massive auditorium seemed to plummet the moment our procession marched down the center aisle. The low hum of whispered conversations abruptly ceased. The flashing lights of the press cameras pivoted away from the stage and locked onto us. Everett froze mid-sentence. His hands tightened around the edges of the podium so hard, his knuckles turned completely white. Greer did not wait for an invitation to speak. She walked straight to the secondary microphone stand positioned for shareholder questions, plugged a small digital device into the audio jack, and looked directly up at her father. "The board does not have control," Greer stated, her voice ringing with lethal clarity through the sound system. "And the operations are fundamentally compromised." Before Everett could signal the sound engineers to cut her microphone, Greer pressed a button on her device. The recorded audio of Everett's own voice blasted through the auditorium speakers. It was cold, arrogant, and undeniably clear. "Use the restricted reserve to pay Bianca," the recorded voice of Everett commanded. "Just get the wire transfer done. As soon as she signs that petition, the leases will naturally revert back to my control." A collective gasp ripped through the audience, but the recording was not finished. "Do not bother me with the compliance warnings regarding Celeste's vendors," the recording continued, sealing his fate. "That is simply the cost of clearing the path. Push the invoices through before the lenders review the collateral file." Pandemonium erupted. Portfolio managers jumped out of their seats. The financial journalists began typing frantically on their laptops. Owen Mercer stepped forward, taking the microphone from Greer. He raised his right hand, looking directly at the panicked faces of the corporate board members seated in the front row. "Under penalty of perjury, I confirm the authenticity of that recording," Owen declared, his voice shaking but resolute. "Furthermore, I confess that Everett Sloan directly coerced the finance department to backdate vendor approvals. He forced us to hide millions of dollars in deferred facility maintenance debt. He deliberately falsified the corporate disclosures sent to our commercial lenders and to the shareholders in this very room, illegally claiming permanent control over infrastructure assets that actually belong entirely to the Hathaway Corridor Trust." Sitting in the VIP section near the front stage, Celeste Rowan realized the ship was sinking. She stood up quickly, keeping her head down, attempting to slip quietly down the side aisle toward the emergency exit. She was trying to completely separate herself from the catastrophe she had helped engineer. Greer saw her moving and immediately signaled the restructuring attorneys. They handed a thick stack of printed documents to the independent board members. "You cannot leave yet, Celeste," Greer called out, stopping the woman in her tracks, "because the board is currently reviewing the encrypted text messages and invoice approvals you traded for a failed immunity bid. You did not just know about the financial diversion. You actively orchestrated the timeline to illegally remove my mother from the corporate structure before the banks could discover the missing funds. Celeste turned pale and sank back into an empty chair, hiding her face from the relentless glare of the press cameras. The managing director of the banking syndicate stood up. He did not need a microphone. His voice carried the absolute weight of institutional capital. On behalf of the primary lending syndicate, the banker announced sternly, I am officially declaring an immediate event of credit default. All Stonegate corridor systems revolving credit facilities are frozen as of this exact minute. The independent board members did not hesitate. They had been briefed by Greer hours ago, and they knew their only chance to avoid federal prison was to act decisively. The lead director stood up and faced the stage. The board of directors is executing an emergency vote, the director stated loudly. Everett Sloan is hereby terminated from his position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. We are freezing all his corporate system access and formally approving an independent restructuring process. Everett completely lost his mind. The carefully constructed mask of the statesman shattered into a million pieces. He lunged away from the podium, his face red with unhinged fury, screaming over the noise of the crowd. You cannot do this to me, Everett roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. I built this company from nothing. Bianca, you are stealing my life's work. You are a thief. I did not scream back. I did not need to raise my voice to destroy him. I walked calmly to the front of the room, standing directly in front of the primary broadcast camera. I looked straight into the lens, knowing millions of people were watching my face. I am not stealing anything from you, Everett, I said, my voice cutting through his hysteria with absolute, icy precision. I am simply refusing to allow one more dollar of shareholder assets, one more working-class job, or one more corporate promise to be placed in the hands of a man who genuinely believes he can use company money to buy my silence. I turned away from him and addressed the stunned audience and the live-stream viewers. To the employees and clients of this network, I offer a solution, I announced. Effective immediately, the Hathaway Freight Continuum will assume control of all compliant transit sites. We are retaining the vast majority of the frontline workforce. We will honor all essential operational obligations. We are going to rebuild this vital national network on a foundation of absolute transparency. I paused, letting my eyes sweep over Everett and Celeste one final time. As for the former chief executive officer, his brand director, and their associated vendors, I concluded, they will now face civil litigation, federal financial investigations, and the profound personal consequences of their own boundless greed. The irony was beautiful and absolute. $50 million had been weaponized on a Friday night as the ultimate price to erase me from Everett's life. Instead, that exact sum of money became the irrefutable forensic evidence that stripped him of his executive chair, his financial leverage, his entire empire, and his unearned legacy. He had paid for his own execution. Hours later, the chaos of the convention center was behind us. Greer and I stood on the windy, gravel-covered roof of the downtown corporate headquarters. The evening air was freezing, but I felt incredibly warm. We leaned against the parapet wall, watching a massive industrial crane slowly lower the illuminated Stonegate letters from the side of the skyscraper. The empire of lies was physically coming down piece by piece. I did not feel the hollow satisfaction of a petty revenge plot. I felt something vastly more profound. I felt the return of my own gravity. For almost 2 decades, I had allowed society and Everett himself to write my story as the quiet, supportive woman standing diligently behind a wildly successful man. I looked at my daughter, the brilliant, ruthless attorney who had helped me burn a corrupt kingdom to the ground to save the people inside it. Nobody would ever tell my story that way again. I was Bianca Hathaway. I might have been the last person to walk into that boardroom today, but I was the only person who walked out with my name, my power, and my absolute worth completely intact. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please Please subscribe to Amelia Revenge Stories, like the video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can reach and empower even more people.